Welcome, Sean Kleefeld. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you on Professor Latinx videocasts.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Sean, even before we get into the why comics and your sort of origin story, I want to hear a little bit about your trademark look, your hat, your hat. Tell us about your hat.
So funny story is a friend of mine was coming through town several years ago, and don't see him very much. And hey, you want to hang out? You grab lunch or something. Great. We ended up at a Panera, and it was a gorgeous day. Sat outside and shot the breeze for, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. And it was fantastic. Had a great time. He went on to, whatever other stuff he's doing. And I went back home, and I was just absolutely burnt. I was head to toe, just all over. I was like fire engine red all over. And I was like, no, okay, I can't be doing this. I need a good hat. And because we were even sitting on an umbrella and everything. But that didn't help. So I started looking around for a good hat that and I had a couple of requirements. A, it had to have a full brim all the way around, right? Couldn't just be a baseball cap and burn your ears or whatever. B, it had to be breathable because I get really warm, particularly outside. So something that's not like a fedora that's all felt and captures all the heat. And 3, I wanted it to be crushable. So I could fold it up, throw it in my back pocket or whatever, which was a little thing that I had seen in the Doctor Who series. With Peter Davidson's Doctor had a crushable hat, and I always thought that was very cool. And, just try and put some style on it and whatever. So I looked around online, spent a lot of time looking around, finally came across a company out of Australia that was making these bush hats out of kangaroo leather. And it fit all my criteria, looked kind of Indiana Jones-ish. So I was like, yeah, okay, cool. Let me pick up on that. And started wearing that around, and it worked exactly the way I hoped. And as I started thinking about it, it also ended up being a great kind of visual for just meeting people. If I was going to a convention or something and somebody said, hey, I want to meet up, I was like, okay, great. Yeah, just look for this hat. And then it's me, right? And you don't have to worry about, okay, well, I'll meet you at this place and who are you? And it kind of rolled from there. And I started thinking about it a little bit more, and that actually kind of led to the full look. If anybody who's met me in person has seen me, I looked kind of like a bad Indiana Jones cosplay. But that's deliberate because of the hat. The hat kind of informed the rest of the look. And I was sitting around thinking about it. It was like, Stan Lee always wore the same thing all the time. Jim Steranko wore the same thing all the time. Seth wears the same thing all the time. It's a great visual. You always know what this guy looks like. You always know what he's going to show up as. So let me run with that too. So kind of went with the rest of the outfit, got kind of this a whole wardrobe of clothes that would work well in a safari kind of thing, and kind of ties into the whole. It does tie into the whole comic studies thing. Is I kind of I try to think of myself somewhat egotistically as kind of an Indiana Jones of comics or something. So I enjoyed digging into this. A lot of this stuff, and makes for a nice visual, nice kind of iconic bit. So I can wear an outfit and everybody can recognize me, or anytime they meet me at a convention or whatever. So.
And next time I'm looking for the Ark of the Covenant, I'll come and look you up, Sean. So
Absolutely.
Tell me, you're an independent scholar, absolutely dedicated to comics and really enriching our understanding of comics. You write for a number of different venues and spaces, the Jack Kirby Collective. Your work's been used for Marvel Entertainment, among others. But what's your story? How did you get into this, Sean?
It's honestly, it's one of those that I've just always been in it, really. I've been reading comics literally as long as I can remember. I know my parents have photographs of me in like Batman t-shirts and whatever when I was like 3, 4 years old, you know, so it's just kind of always been there. You know, so I grew up with comics, reading Superman, Batman, Justice League, all of that stuff, watching Super Friends on TV. And I got to be, so on my 11th birthday then, like every year, I got a few comics, among other things. And one of the comics I got was Fantastic Four number 254, which was middle of John Byrne's run on that series. And I was just absolutely blown away by that. It was, I'm sure most people don't remember the issue, is the Fantastic Four are exploring the negative zone. They're doing, you know, very Fantastic Four things. And at the end of it, the alien in that particular series captures Reed Richards' mind and absorbs it out of him. And Reed Richards is left as a lifeless body, more or less. And the last line is, Reed Richards is dead, or something. And I just had to know what came next, right? It was one of those, oh my God, what's going on? You can't kill him off. He was the main guy. How do you? So I got the next issue, and then the next issue, and then the next issue, and right, and that kind of snowballed, and became a real big fan of Fantastic Four because of that. You know, John Byrne's run on the FF is, you know, lauded for a good reason, right? But as I started reading those, I started like, okay, this is great. There, after I'd read, I don't know, a dozen issues or something, I was like, well, yeah, there's 200 some more issues that I haven't read yet. So let me find out, these characters are really interesting. Let me see more. So I started working my way backwards, and, you know, here's Marv Wolfman's run, and here's Roy Thomas's run, here's Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all that. And that just became more and more fascinating. And interestingly, around that same time, I was getting into it, particularly into the Kirby era stuff, was when Kirby was having that big fight with Marvel to try and get his artwork back. So there were a lot of, in the comics press, there was a lot of news articles about Jack Kirby, not only trying to get that his artwork back, but, you know, just general background information. Here's this other stuff he did. And, oh, by the way, he also invented the X-Men, the Avengers, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, by the way, he used to be doing this stuff in the 40s, and oh, wait, he invented romance comics, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was basically, it kind of became a broadening scope, as every time I found out something more about whatever it was I was looking at, whether it's a Fantastic Four or Jack Kirby or Marvel in general or whatever, it kind of opened up this new avenue of things to look at and be interested in. So I was looking at, you know, Fantastic Four, and wait, the Avengers guest starred in it. So who are the Avengers? Well, let me go find out who the Avengers are. I started reading that. And, you know, who is this Jack Kirby guy? Okay, well, let me find out here. Oh, wait, what's this Fourth World thing? Okay, let me find out about that. Wait, here's Darkseid, and he's got all this other stuff. And wait, he started showing up in the Super Friends cartoon. And wait, so here's the Super Friends. And wait, that's really the Justice League. And we're the Justice League. Well, here's the Justice Society, you know, and it just kind of one of those spiraled out and out and out and out. And, you know, it just kind of has been doing that since I was 11 years old, pretty much, right? And now here I'm pushing 50, and it's pretty much the breadth of comics at this point, you know. Oh, wait, here's these people in Japan are doing cool comics, and these people in France are doing cool comics, and these people online are doing cool comics, and what's all this cool stuff? There's just so much amazing stuff. You know, and I very much used to be, it started off, I was a fan of superheroes first, and not comics, just superheroes, you know. So I was, you know, like I said, we're watching the Super Friends cartoon, or the Filmation cartoons, or the Superman movie, the Batman movies later when those came out. But, you know, the more and more I saw of it, the more I saw there's these other things out there, and seeing what was coming out, you know, seeing all that great stuff coming out of Britain in, you know, the 1980s, and, you know, oh my God, what's this Watchmen thing? What's this Maus thing? You know, and all of that big stuff was coming right around the time that as my interests were broadening, the industry seemed to be kind of broadening too. So, like I said, it's kind of always been there, and I've just spent the last several decades looking at all of it. And it's just been an absolutely fascinating journey the whole time. I mean, every time I turn around, there's something else I haven't seen before or something else new to learn. So I keep digging into it.
I love it. And also that comics itself as a kind of university, kind of, you know, archive education, training in all kind of methods, approaches, you know, to the study and enrichment of a particular part of the world that we are making, creating, right? Cultural phenomena.
Yeah.
I just love it. I love it. I love your journey, and thank you for that. Tell me, gosh, so then you started to systematize this, right? You've been researching, and then you started writing. So tell us a little bit about why this was important to you.
That's a good question. there's a few answers involved in that. So depending on, so when I started getting into this, you know, as a teenager, one of the things that, you know, this was pre-internet, pre-web, right? You had to dig around for fanzines and reading the Stan Soapbox column and whatever to try and get any information on what was going on, right? Because I lived in a very small town. I grew up as a population of like 7,000 or something like that. So there's not a whole lot of interaction. We didn't have a local comic shop at all. So I had to get stuff from the drugstore, you know, whatever. So there just wasn't a lot of information available. So what I was doing at that time was anytime I did find something, I just grabbed onto it and, you know, okay, this is something I need to hold on to. And I would just collect. I ended up collecting a lot of that information in 3-ring binders. You know, I would maybe Xerox if it was a newspaper or something that was going to fall apart, I'd Xerox it and put a 3-hole punch in, throw it in the binder. And I had all this information stored in 3-ring binders, which not surprisingly got very unwieldy very quickly. So even with the scant information that was available then. So I did that for several years. And then in the mid 90s, the internet, the World Wide Web came about, and I started hearing about that, and I said, hey, that sounds like a cool thing. And I was on America Online at the time, and I'd read at some point, oh, hey, they give you server space. And I think it was like a whopping 5 megabytes or something like that, right? I was like, oh, okay, great, let me play around. And I sat down, I taught myself HTML, which kind of sounds cool and impressive now, but it literally was a 16-page booklet that had all the HTML there was at that point. It took me a weekend to figure it out. And I sat down and built out some kind of generic web pages and said, yeah, okay, that's cool. What do I do with this now? And, you know, my thought was, well, I've got all these binders full of material on comics that I want to keep and want to be able to reference. What if I transferred that all online, did those as web pages, and then I'd have access to that all the time. I wouldn't have to lug around these ugly notebooks with decaying paper and hard to find stuff. I could organize it. And so I started building websites out of that material. And because there was still I was still having issues or concerns or problems getting as much information as I wanted. So when I did find something, not only did I collect that, I tried to extrapolate on that as well, right? So, okay, if I read this piece over here and I read this other piece over here, I don't know the bit in the middle, but I can make some assumptions and kind of educate myself and make some educated guesses here. And maybe somebody else might be interested in that. So I would write something down and post that. So, you know, hey, you know, Jack Kirby did this over here and Jack Kirby did this over here. And you know, those two things might actually be kind of related, even though they were for different companies. So how do those play together? So some of that was the idea, it started at least as the idea of working some of that out for myself and you know, by the process of writing, you kind of have to formalize your thinking on that, right? To put it down into words and use grammatical structure and whatever. You actually have to organize all your thoughts to do that. So part of it was that, and part of it was just getting this information out there that I didn't think was anywhere else at the time. And that's been a big chunk of it. For, you know, you've got the pieces up for, you know, my Fanthropology book, my webcomics book, and a lot of that information is, or at least at the time that I was writing it, was stuff that I wasn't seeing anywhere else. And, you know, I am referencing, here's the work that other people have done, but I'm trying to make connections that other people may not have seen or may not have thought, at least aren't talking about, even if they have seen them.
Right.
So let me try and put those in writing. And some of that's, you know, like I said, organizing my own thoughts, and some of it is putting it out there for other people to say, you know, oh, hey, yeah, that's right, or that's wrong, or that makes sense, but, or hey, let me add on to that. So a lot of my writing ends up being along those lines. And what I find interesting too is, you know, I've been blogging now for over a decade, which means that there's a lot of stuff that I've written and completely forgotten about. And what I find amusing is, from time to time, I'll, you know, hey, here's a obscure comic creator from the 1940s I just heard about. Let me Google him and see what information is out there. And I'll find the only article is something that I had written myself. And, you know, I wrote that in 2006, and I've completely forgotten about that. But I have that information out there. It's like, oh, well, this is the stuff I dug up, and that's what you go. I mean, that's and I don't need to remember it now because it's out there. The one I keep going back to, I do remember I've written this now, but Paul Sampliner, who worked for independent comics way back in the 30s and 40s, there's like no information about him anywhere. I did as much scouring as I could and came up with a blog post about him 10 years ago or something. That's still like one of the only pieces of information out there. There's no Wikipedia page for him, or he's barely referenced when you're reading about Wheeler Nicholson or any of the other folks in the early days of DC there. You know, and it's kind of like an ongoing project for me. I keep going back to it every now and then. It's like, oh, can I find anything else more about him? Has somebody else written something new on him or whatever?
Your work is very, very so important. And in a way, you've kind of already brought us to this place about vision and approach, kind of the urgent impulse, the passion to synthesize, to dig into the kind of records, the archives that have been buried, and to kind of bring it to light. Is there something else, Sean, here in terms of your approach and vision?
A lot of it is just very self-driven. You know, I've never been one to, you know, I'm not, as a rule, I'm not generally writing for the purpose of, you know, the clicks or the money or anything like that. Obviously, there's not a ton of money in this, but I'm not even thinking of low budget stuff. It's whatever happens to interest me. You know, hey, here's this weird character that no one's ever heard of, or no one's written about, certainly. Let me see what I can find on him, and let me put that out there. And that's just for my interest and edification, me processing this information and trying to do something with it. And that's kind of how I end up processing it. I've got another blog post I did, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, on Paul Henry Cassidy, who was an early Superman artist back in I think he started on like issue 7 or 9 or something like that. He didn't work in the industry for a long time, but he was there for long enough. And you know what? He's the guy who, his biggest claim to fame really is he's the guy who put the S on the back of Superman's cape. that's a really stupid, obscure part of trivia for even within the Superman context. But you know, hey, that's something I find interesting for any variety of reasons. So
Yeah, well, those are the details like that that allow others to come along, whether we see it or another generation sees it, but can build on and dig and write the stories that haven't really been written. So thank you for that. Tell us
sure,
about your book, Fanthropology.
sure.
Fanthropology, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the first full-fledged book I tried writing. This goes back to, again, kind of that broadening scope of interest in things. At some point in, I don't know, I suppose it would have been the late 90s, one of the things I became interested in as just broadening interest was the comic book fans themselves. And part of that was, like I said, I grew up in a very small town. I was basically the only kid in town who read comics. And there was like one or two other guys, but I was the only one who was really into it. They knew the characters, but they weren't buying stuff on a monthly basis or whatever. So as I was getting into my 20s, I was starting to go, I was going to conventions and seeing creators and buying old back issues and whatever. And I always left those conventions feeling like I had missed out on something. And it took me a long time to figure out what. And what I was missing out on is I was going there to meet those creators and get autographs and buying those back issues, stuff that wasn't at my local comic shop or that I could buy online at that. I think you could buy stuff online at that point, but there weren't many vendors. But I was leaving these conventions and feeling like I was missing out. And what I realized I was missing out on was that fan experience, right? I wasn't going with a group of friends and we were all hanging out and just having a good time. I wasn't going there and meeting up with friends that I only saw at conventions or anything like that. And it got me thinking about, well, what is this comic fandom experience? I mean, I'd read about it, right? I'd certainly seeing letters in the back of the comics and the fanzines had to be created by somebody and all that. But I wasn't really, I didn't feel like I was really experiencing it very much. So I was looking around and trying to get an interest and trying to figure out and understand what the comic book fan group was like, as why they come together, why do you do cosplay, why do you meet, or how do you connect with people at a convention, and just the whole gamut. But this was, like I said, late 90s, early 2000s, something like that, and no one was writing about that. Henry Jenkins had been doing some work in fandom, broadly speaking, but his work tended to focus more on sci-fi. And so he's talking about Star Trek and Blake 7 and some of those types of things, which is great, but I wasn't seeing anything with regards to comics. The only other thing that was out there really was Bill Shelley had a couple of books out at that point, I think. But his books on fandom, comic book fandom, were specifically just histories and he didn't really get into the thinking behind it or a whole lot of what people, he was kind of just more looking at the factual information. Here's what Jerry Bales did. Here's what Roy Thomas did. Here's what, all these people were doing. Here's the Maggie Thompson. She started this and whatever. But it didn't really get into very much of kind of the whys and wherefores of all of that. So the comic book Fanthropology was my attempt at trying to figure that out, basically, because no one else had done it at that time. Relied heavily on Jenkins, of course, relied a lot on Bill Shelley's, there's a lot of references to both of them in there. But then there's also, I tried to dig up and basically teach myself psychology 101, as a matter of fact, to figure out, how these, how these people create archetypes within a in-group, and how does that differentiate them from this other group over there? It's that kind of whole us versus them notion. And so that's what the whole book is about, is trying to figure out how all that works together. There's a little bit of history in there and a little bit of kind of high level stuff. But that's what that book is. And I think for its time, I think it works very well, or it worked very well at its time. I think I published that in 2007, if I remember right. But what I found interesting is that it was like right at the front end of fandom being a thing that people studied like on a regular basis, so there was, right after this came out, within maybe a year or two, there was almost an explosion of academic work and just regular published books and whatever on fandom and fan activities, and there were documentaries being created, and all of this interest and information was started coming out, which unfortunately has kind of superseded a lot of everything that I wrote here. This works as kind of a really base level primer at this point, but there's been a whole lot of research that has been done since then, a whole lot of excellent academic work that has been done since then that really gets into it a lot deeper than I could possibly have. But like I said, at the time there was nothing out there. I didn't have any points of reference. So that's why I put it together, is just to kind of work through that and have something figured out for myself.
Again, right? You have to kind of do what you do and then hope that others come along as they did and refine and advance and complicate and even refute. But that's how knowledge advances, right?
Yeah.
Why webcomics? And this is like, particularly for me, a really exciting area because, gosh, I mean, in a way, like you've been talking, the way you were talking about your fanthropology, we don't have a systematic study yet just on webcomics. So tell us about this book. Yeah.
Yeah, this is another one where there's just nothing written on it, or very, very, very little. As of today, I believe there are 6 books in total that have ever been printed on webcomics, and 4 of them are not published anymore. They're out of print. And the other 2, both are by same guy, Brad Geigar, who does some wonderful comics work himself. But those are more geared towards the creators themselves and kind of almost a how-to type of setup. There's just not a whole lot being written. And honestly, I don't for the life of me know why in 2020 this hasn't been studied more. I started getting interested in webcomics right around the turn of the century, right? Like 2000, 2001, thereabouts. And I remember coming to the scene and thinking, wow, I'm really late to this. And I felt like I needed to do a lot of catch up and trying to figure out, oh, well, there's all these guys that have already been established. And, if I start reading PvP now, well, I understand that because he's already been doing this for several years, right? And I remember thinking, actively having to convince myself to try and pick up some of those what were then considered long-running comics like Penny Arcade and PvP and some of those. And I had to sit down and actively convince myself, well, this would be no different than when I picked up Fantastic Four number 254, and there were 200 issues before that. That's the exact same thing. I dove in then. I've got to dive into this now. And that was 2001, right? 2002, something like that. At the time, there were, I felt, not a good presentation, the presentation model that really worked. Yeah, you could certainly go online, you can go to a website and read these comics, and you could get the punchline if it was a gag comic, or follow along with the story well enough if it was a more of a serial. But the navigation, the user experience, wasn't great. I felt at the time, so I didn't really get into it right away. It took me another few years. And honestly, the way I got into that was Phil and Katia Folio's Girl Genius. I had read Phil's work back in the 80s. One of my interests in high school was Dungeons and Dragons, and Phil had a comic strip in the back of Dragon magazine that I really, really enjoyed all the time. So when I saw he was doing this Girl Genius thing, I was right on board. I think that started in 2001, 2002 maybe. But it was a print-only magazine. But, you know, hey, I was going to the comic shop anyway, just picked that up along with Fantastic Four and whatever else I was getting. And after, I think it was 6 or 8 issues, he started posting some of the information and some of the stories online too. And I looked at that and was like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but I'm like the print version better. So I just kept getting that until I think it was around issue 13 or 14. He and Kaja realized that they were basically breaking even on the print comics, but every time a print comic would come out, the web traffic would go way up, and they'd actually end up making money off of the web comic through, you know, ancillary sales of, you know, t-shirts or whatever else they were selling at the time. And they said, well, we're just breaking even on the comic, on the printed comic. Let's scrap that and just do it exclusively online. And at that point, I was like, okay, well, you know, I've been enjoying this for 13 issues. If I want to keep reading this, I've got to go all in on webcomics. And like I said, I think that was 2004, 2005 maybe. And at that point, I was still thinking, okay, I'm really late to the game here. You know, this has been going on. They've been running this for a while. PvP had been going on for 6 or 8 years at that point, I think. Penny Arcade had been going on for 6 or 8 years. A bunch of others. But I quickly realized that the reason why it wasn't getting any traction in, say, like the news outlets was because there's no money in it at that time, right? Nobody was making really any money per se, not enough to make a living, certainly. But then people started doing that, and you know, you started getting you know, the Scott Kurtz and Phil and Kaya Folio and all of them. They start making money and saying, hey, I'm earning a living doing this. You know, I'm selling ads on the site. I'm selling t-shirts. I'm selling printed copies of the book after the fact, after they've been online. This is an industry. We can do this. I was like, yeah, okay, this is the thing. So that's when I, you know, trying to investigate at the time how webcomics worked financially. That was just kind of an interest that I had personally. I had just finished up my MBA at the time, so I had all this kind of, you know, spreadsheets and stuff kind of flowing through my head already. And so I started writing on that, just blogging about it. Here's a thing. Here's how this could work. Here's how this financial model might work, and that kind of thing. And I did that for, I don't know, 5-6 years, and I still wasn't seeing anybody else talking about it, you know, and it was just, yeah, and it's consistently been like that. And frankly, I don't understand that. I mean, I kind of got it early on. Like I said, there wasn't a financial model. It just seemed kind of like hobby-ish in the early 2000s, you know, and so, yeah, okay, I could see why it's not getting covered on The Beat or Newsarama or any of those. But, you know, 10 years on, 15 years on, 20 years on, you know, we've got industries here. I mean, the Penny Arcade guys, that is a literal industry. There's what, like 15, 16 employees there. They've done TV shows. They've done, you know, promotional spots for major companies like, you know, Microsoft and PlayStation and them. They've several times over proven that's a viable industry. It's making money just as well as, you know, Marvel or DC or Dark Horse or any of the traditional publishers. But for whatever reasons, that's just not been covered. And I go into a little bit of that into the book, right? There's some rationale for it, I think, some. There's the notion that, webcomics just haven't been around as long, right? So there's not as much to study. Charles Schulz was working on comics for 40, 50 years before the web was even invented, right? So he had this huge bulk of material built up before webcomics were even a thing. And people had time to study all that, right? And I think I read something from Jared Gardner a couple of years ago too, which kind of struck me. Is he posited that one of the reasons that academia largely didn't have anything to do with comics for such a long time was because there was no place to really talk about them and publish about them in terms of academic journals, right? They didn't really fit into the literature journals that were out there, and they didn't really fit into the art journals out there. They're just kind of, because it's this art and language and all of this kind of works together, there was no one place that always made sense. You always kind of had to, okay, well, I can talk about Watchmen, but I can only talk about it from the standpoint of what Alan Moore did and kind of ignore Dave Gibbons on this, right? We're talking about the layers and structure of the metatext or whatever. Or I can sit down and talk about what Dave Gibbons did and kind of ignore all the backstory and whatever that Alan was putting into things. There was the Inks Journal, came out in '93 and ran for a couple of years, but that was what, for only 3 or 4 years. That was pretty short-lived. And there's the new version of the Inks Journal, which started, was that 2 or 3 years ago? But that's only 2 or 3 years ago, right? So up until that time, up until 2 years ago, there was basically nowhere where you could sit down and write a journal article about comics. So, no one was really focused on that. And I think that kind of is exemplified even more with webcomics because there's the additional component of the technology behind it, right? And if you're talking about Watchmen or Maus or Dark Knight Returns or whatever, the printing technology isn't all that different than it was 200 years ago, right? I mean, it's computerized. It's larger production runs. Also, there are a lot of differences there, but the fundamentals are basically the same. You put ink on a stamp, and you squish that stamp onto a piece of paper. You've got a printed comic. With the web, that layer just doesn't exist, right? There's the technology involved of crafting the comics, because a lot of these are done digitally now on a tablet or something, and then uploading that, and you've got server capacity, and you've got to talk about how the internet works in general, computers talking back and forth to one another. And I think that third component is something that a lot of people don't really, they maybe figured out the art component, they've figured out the writing component, but they haven't figured out the technical component to kind of bring all those together. I have a relatively unique background that does kind of mix all of those. So I'm able to kind of talk to, I think I'm one of the few people who is able to talk to all three aspects of that a little bit more readily than other people. My bachelor's degree was actually in graphic design. So I did learn, I grew up learning all of the print techniques and the art and all of those angles of things. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time, figuring out writing just by sitting down and doing the blog and Kirby Collector and everything else I've been working on. But then my day job for the past 20-ish years has been the internet in some capacity. I've either been designing or developing or doing, I was web admin for a while. My current official day job title is digital media strategist. So, I've been on kind of all aspects of how the web works as well as, so I know I can speak the language of the IT guys and know how all that pulls together. So I think that that's one of the reasons is that webcomics haven't been discussed in those terms in academia, is because there's that IT component that is people just kind of not sure how to deal with, right? You know, they can read the comics and say, well, Rain of Tail Matters, Smile, perfect example, right? Everybody loves talking about that. It's a great book, and tons of kids have picked that up, got them to read, fantastic, lots of things we can talk about here. But that was a webcomic first, right? But before Scholastic got a hold of that, she posted that online. Nobody talks about that. And honestly, the first draft I did of this book, I completely forgot that as well, and I didn't reference her at all because it just totally skipped my brain. And I think that's, a lot of people, that obviously she did something right to get the attention of Scholastic, to have them come to her and say, hey, we want to publish this, right? And it's a great story, and you can see, all of the storytelling, the art, etc., that goes into that. But everybody comes at it from that perspective as a completed work, when that's not what it was. You kind of see the same thing with Watchmen too, right? That was originally a monthly series, came out for a year, basically. I think it was a year and a bit. I think the last couple issues were late, if I remember right. But everybody reads it as a trade paperback and talks about it in terms of the graphic novel format, which it wasn't originally. It was, you didn't get that cool effect of the back covers. For anybody who hasn't read the the floppy version, you don't get that cool effect of the back covers with the blood dripping down over the clock, and it gets deeper and deeper. By the time you get to issue 12, it's almost an entire page of red. So there's some element of that that's lost because you're not thinking of it. Most people aren't thinking of it in those terms. And I think you see a lot of that. The Nimona is another one, right? Started off as a webcomic. Everybody looked at that and said, hey, this is great, but let's publish it. And that's when it started getting attention. And you see that in that's the other thing you see in the news articles, your newsaramas, your Comics Beat, whatever. People tend to talk about webcomics only in relation to the print comics. Oh, hey, Mark Waid is doing this thing on the internet. Oh, hey, Warren Ellis is doing this thing on the internet. Or, hey, Scott Clevenger used to be on the internet, now he's doing this print thing. And I think it's that internet component, that technical component, that throws people. They're not quite sure how that works. They're not quite sure how the business model operates. They're not sure how the technical angle works. I think that's where the breakdown happens. I think a lot of people aren't seeing it in those terms.
Yeah, one of the a lot of sense, Sean. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, one of the interesting thing when I first wrote the book proposal, it was shopped around, and they had several professors take a look at it and say, hey, what do you think? What would you want to see or not see in this? And I remember one of the responses came back, said, this sounds good. This is something we definitely need, but it doesn't talk about, the genres at all. And I was like, well, no, because the genres aren't part and parcel of webcomics. Genre, you can talk about genre in any media format, right? There are genres within cinema or comics or TV or prose or whatever. That's that's not what we're talking about here. Webcomics specifically is a venue of comics in the same way that graphic novels. That's like trying to say there's a genre to graphic novels, or there's a genre to monthly serial comics, or something like that. It doesn't quite work like that, right?
That makes sense.
People don't. I think a lot of people miss that. They're not quite sure. They haven't quite figured out how to process it yet, and I think there's a lot of that still going on.
Well, fortunately, your book is almost out, and you will be helping kind of open that pathway for many of us. Your blog, you've mentioned over couple decades now. So this is definitely teaching by other means. Do you see it that way? And what are some of the other spaces where you also kind of disseminate knowledge about comics?
Yeah, I don't look at it as teaching per se. I mean, I try to be educational with it. One of the things I often have trouble remembering, though, is that something that may have known for years, something that I read about and learned about long ago, it might not be common knowledge yet. So I tend not to think of it in educational terms like that. Or I don't think of my writing, my blog, certainly in terms of educational terms. I remember having conversations in high school with one of the few people, and like I said, there weren't many people who read comics at all, but I do remember having a conversation with somebody back then talking about Bill Finger being the co-creator of Batman. And that was still up until the documentary, when was that, like 4 or 5 years ago, most people still didn't know that, right? Even within comics. And I tend to forget that, honestly. I forget that a lot, that what I'm writing about isn't necessarily common knowledge. And I try to check myself manually when I can. But, I don't approach my writing like that typically. In a lot of cases, it's, like I said earlier, it's a lot of just organizing, as a way of organizing my thoughts and trying to process, here's how I'm thinking about this subject, whether that's a creator, whether that's a comic series, whether that's a character or a publisher, publishing model, the technology behind it, whatever. And most of my writing tends to be along those lines. Same with like Jack Kirby Collector, right? My column in that, I've been doing that for about a decade as well now, I think, something like that. My column every issue is I take one character that Jack Kirby designed and try to look at how Jack Kirby designed him and why, and how that may have changed over however long he happened to draw that character, right? So what did the Thing look like in Fantastic Four #1 versus what did he look like in Fantastic Four number 102? And where did that change happen? How much of that was really Joe Sinnott's inking, and how much of that was Dick Ayers inking, or whomever, and how much of that was Jack? What was he thinking how did he switch this? Which may well be educational for somebody who's reading that for the first time, who maybe hasn't studied that particular comic series or not studied it that closely. But it still comes back to me figuring it out for myself. That's something that I'm personally interested in and trying to figure out. Why did Jack Kirby visually approach Icarus different than he approached Galactus? He was, if you sit down, because I've written articles on both of them at various points, Galactus strangely looks absolutely identical every time Jack drew him. He had a guide of some kind. He drew this guy once and couldn't remember for crap what he looked like, and kept going back to that over and over, is what my figure is. But Icarus, since he was drawing that on a monthly basis, he just kind of like drawing, I'll just do the same thing that I did on the last page, and do the same thing I did on the last page, and the same thing I did on the last page. But then over the course of a year, that's kind of morphed a little bit. His hair got shorter, the design on his belt kind of streamlined a little bit. And it's a way of me looking at, trying to understand what Jack Kirby was thinking while he was doing these drawings on a day-to-day basis. When he sat down at the drafting table, picked up his pencil, and started scribbling what was going through his head in terms of a visual design. And if that is interesting or educational or a learning opportunity for somebody else, that's fantastic. But that's not, it's more of a learning opportunity for me. And I'm kind of reminded, I think it was Feynman who said that, you don't really understand something until you can teach it to somebody else in simplistic terms. I forget exactly the exact quote, but he said something to that effect. And that's kind of what it's like for me, is I'm trying to get to that point where I understand it enough that I can sit down and explain that to the next person. And if it happens to be, if I can explain it well enough that you get it, that just means I've gotten it and I've kind of understood it. And that's kind of my approach to anything that I'm writing here. Like, you know, whether it's a blog, whether it's Jack Kirby Collector, whether it's something that I put together for Marvel or whoever else I've worked for, you know, that's kind of the intention there, is that's me processing everything, me trying to understand everything. And then, you know, I may as well put this out there for everybody else because I've already done the work on it. So it's the research is the ends of itself, and then the means are the writing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. So webcomics, fanthropology, constant sort of blogging in ways that kind of reveal the kind of, you know, minutia of comic studies. What's next for you, Sean?
I don't know if this is actually next, but what I've been threatening to write for a while is a piece on a book on the Blackstone comics of the 1930s and 40s. The Blackstone is obviously the actual Harry Blackstone Sr. was a magician back in the day, and very popular one for his day. Came after Houdini and a lot of the big names that you typically know, Thurston and those kinds of guys. And he kind of made a big name for himself, big enough that he had a comic book that was several comic books actually based off of him and his adventures. It was actually created by the same guy who created The Shadow, and you know, he wrote, I think it was, I don't know, something like 30 issues, and I'm drawing a blank on the order. It was popular enough that it went through several publishers over the course of, I think it was about 10, 15 years, something like that. And it would end up being, it was a popular enough book that it kept selling until the publisher decided they didn't want to do comics anymore, and they collapsed. And there was one issue by EC, and they got the one issue out, and he was going to meet with Bill Gaines. Wait a minute, no, the Bill or Max?
I think
the father.
Yeah.
He went.
Max, yeah.
Yeah, so he went to meet him right after the first issue was kind of done and wrapped up, and, you know, talking about how we can do this. That was the weekend that he died. So he never ended up meeting him because he was in that, you know, nasty boating accident literally 2 days before. So then that never got published. So he ended up taking it to Timely, and Timely did, I think it's like 6 or 8 issues or something like that. I found it absolutely fascinating. The one of the main artists, a guy by the name of E.C. Stoner, was the same guy who created Mr. Peanut, the icon character from the Planters folks, right? A lot of weird little things going on here. Just absolutely fascinating. Absolutely minutia. Nobody ever cares about this stuff. None of these comics have been reprinted in, I don't know, 30, 40 years at least. Nobody's clamoring for them, certainly. But I find it fascinating, all the way, like, all this stuff kind of interacts and mixes together. So that's going to be hopefully my next thing. And like I said, I've been threatening to write this for a little while now.
Yeah. Well, I love it. Yeah, you should write it, and I'll be the first to buy it. So you've mentioned a couple of webcomics. Maybe you can mention a couple of others for our viewers or listeners that are really exciting to you, and comics generally, or, you know, comic studies. Like, what's exciting you right now?
Ooh, there's a lot going on. Within webcomics, I'm trying to think of some of I think one of the more interesting ones that I haven't seen the reboot. He just restarted is Homestuck. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of that one. That one ran for, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, something like that. Was a really interesting story that was kind of built along the premise of it was almost approached as one of those point and click adventure games from like the 80s or 90s that you'd get. And it was a really fascinating story in the first place, got into some real surreal kind of things. He did a good mix, I think, of bringing in different elements. So it wasn't just like many webcomics are just here's, a handful of panels and you click onto the next page and here's a handful of more panels. He got into some interactive stuff, which is debatably not comics, but since they were a fairly minor part, I still consider them comics. He got into some multimedia stuff. Again, you could debate whether or not that's comics, but I think he did it judiciously enough that the broad work, the Homestuck, is considered comics. He finished that a few years ago. He just started a new version of that, like a 2.0, as it were. I have not read that yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing what he does with that. Different climate, different technology available. So I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to and enjoying anything that just is a good storytelling experience. There's a lot of good ones out there. 2 of them that I talk into the book are Questionable Content and Dumbing of Age. Those are both creatively, artistically, I guess, are pretty straightforward in terms of just here's the story of, Gen Xers or Gen Zers or whatever he's specifically calling them. Getting through life and kind of slice of life kind of pieces. They're just very creatively done, I think. Anything with an interesting story. Atomic Robo is a good one. I enjoy particularly what I like about him is he's been able to, or they've been able to kind of go back and forth between print and digital pretty seamlessly. It's been very creative. In terms of print, I'm still discovering new stuff all the time. You go through Kickstarter, there's a dozen interesting things on any given day. The last one I read just this weekend, I forget when the official book release is, right around the time we're recording here. I'm sure it'll be out by the time this goes live. Is Banned Book Club by Ryan Estrada and Kim Hyuk Sung. I hope I pronounced that right. It's his wife. And he basically gets into, it's basically her story of living in Korea in the 1980s and, basically going from a typically almost stereotypically model Korean student to not quite an anarchist, but somebody who's definitely pushing the boundaries of what's out there and what's acceptable and being a political activist and that. Absolutely fascinating story, and I think one that's increasingly relevant these days. Not just within the context that Korea, they live in South Korea, things are more or less fine there, but obviously problems in North Korea. We're seeing more political issues here in the United States, in the UK, France to a degree, a bunch of other countries. So I think that kind of thing is going to be interesting. I think a lot of things that interest me now in the print world in particular are those that kind of get that historical context. Again, kind of that educational piece is what is out there, what can I learn from something out of this? So not just what's Superman up to today or how did Batman defeat the Joker this time, but here's a history and of all of the context around the Tiananmen Square massacre, or I finished a little while back, Barefoot Gen, the manga about the atomic bombs that we dropped on Japan. That was hugely enlightening. I'm really getting into that kind of stuff lately. Biographies in general. That's one thing I haven't seen enough of in webcomics at this point. I'd love to see more biography style comics. There's a lot of memoir out there, but not a whole lot of biography, which I'd love to see more of. And in terms of comic studies, I just love seeing the enthusiasm. There's still a lot of stuff out there left to be explored. There's still people talking about Maus, still people talking about Watchmen, Persepolis, all of those. I get it. That's fine. But what I love is the last few conventions that I've been at, there was just a huge amount of enthusiasm behind the younger presenters, right? You get your, the work that, guys like Thomas Inge and Charles Hatfield and all those guys, it's great. I love that. Very educational, very insightful. But in terms of the vitality, that enthusiasm, they were fighting against, in a lot of degrees, just kind of getting that respect and getting out there, right? I think the newer folks today kind of take that as given. And so they're able to run out there with their enthusiasm and just charge ahead and, hey, I'm going to talk about this and whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be Dark Knight Returns again. It doesn't have to be Watchmen again. And those are, like I said, those are still getting brought up, which is fine. But they're also talking about, whatever Gail Simone's working on, or whatever Raina Telgemeier's working on, or whatever Tom King's doing these days, right? So they're out there. They're talking about their favorite books. They're talking about a lot of what excites them, and that excites me. To see that enthusiasm. I think that's fantastic.
Wow. Well, yes, I'm right with you too. The new generation and all of the kind of incredible passion and the new things that they're sort of revealing for us. Sean Kleefeld, thank you so much for talking Fanthropology, webcomics, your own kind of deep dive into the kind of untold histories. Thank you, Sean.
No, thank you again for having me, Frederick. This was fantastic. Loved it.